In Burkina Faso, a decision both extraordinary and divisive has seized the world's attention. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, the government buried more than 200 tons of watermelons in the Sahel sands. This was neither a mistake nor a ceremonial gesture. It was a calculated act, strategic in intent and radical in symbolism. The move, in a nation where food insecurity remains painfully high, bewildered observers. Western headlines ridiculed the policy. Commentators questioned the logic. How, they asked, could a country battling hunger afford to discard edible crops in the desert? Yet the explanation, as officials later revealed, was not about immediate consumption, it was about soil, sovereignty, and a quiet rebellion against long-standing systems of dependency. The initiative, dubbed Project Oasis, sought to transform surplus and spoiled watermelons into subterranean reservoirs. Agricultural officials explained that once buried, the fruits composed largely of water and packed with organic minerals could decompose into moisture-retaining sponges. In doing so, they would revive microbial life, improve soil texture, and offer new fertility to lands rendered barren by drought. Early reports suggested the theory was not without merit. In trial plots, moisture levels lasted weeks longer than in untreated soil, while millet seedlings sprouted faster and rooted deeper. For communities long familiar with disappointment from parched earth, these modest results signaled a kind of rebirth. Yet, beyond biology, the project carried a deeper message. Traoré, in a national address, cast the melon burials as a declaration of independence. Burkina Faso, he said, had for decades relied on imported fertilizers, delivered from Europe and tied to contracts that often left local farmers vulnerable. If trade routes broke or donors withheld, entire planting cycles failed. Project Oasis, by contrast, aimed to sever those chains, proving that the land itself, through waste, resilience, and ingenuity, could sustain life without dependency. It was, at once, a practical experiment and a symbolic revolt. The method was far from universally accepted. Domestic critics worried about risks, pests, methane emissions, uneven nutrient release. But the government countered with early data showing increased microbial activity and improved soil health. Financial officials added that even partial adoption could reduce fertilizer imports by double-digit percentages, potentially saving millions annually. For a country where every dollar saved might translate into new classrooms, clinics, or electrification, the stakes were significant. Still, what distinguished the project was not just its potential savings, but its posture. Burkina Faso was refusing to wait for outside solutions. It was writing its own script. The story might have remained a localized experiment had it not been for a leak. Weeks after the initial burials, a memo from a European agricultural lobby surfaced. The document, urgent in tone, warned that if Burkina Faso's method proved scalable, it could threaten the multi-billion-dollar fertilizer trade in West Africa. The memo did not urge counter-research, but rather narrative control. It recommended campaigns to portray the project as reckless, even immoral, contrasting images of buried fruit with hungry children. It suggested donor organizations be pressured to withdraw support. In short, it was a call to discredit before the idea could spread. The leak had the opposite effect. Within Burkina Faso, radio stations read the memo aloud. Citizens asked why powerful institutions felt so threatened if the project truly posed no risk. Farmers who had witnessed the first green shoots from buried melon plots spoke with pride. "We used to guard borders," one local volunteer said. "Now we guard the soil." His words, broadcast on community radio, resonated widely. Grassroots movements sprouted in villages. Women's groups collected spoiled fruit for burial. Students learned to plant water in classrooms, and cooperatives experimented with composts, blending melon pulp with market waste. What began as a top-down directive was fast becoming a bottom-up movement. But outside Burkina Faso, resistance hardened. Fertilizer, lobbyists, and donor-linked think tanks labeled the project a biosecurity risk. Western media, once mocking, shifted toward accusations. Headlines called it a dangerous distraction, a cover for corruption, even foreign interference. In Washington and Brussels, officials avoided public comment but privately fretted that the initiative represented more than agriculture. It symbolized a continent refusing aid dependency. For decades, Africa's agricultural story had been narrated as one of external rescue. Now, Burkina Faso was rewriting it as self-determination. The challenge was less about melons and more about meaning. Meanwhile, in West Africa, neighbors took note. In Mali, radio callers debated using fruit waste for soil revival. In Niger, agricultural students drafted composting designs. Chad invited Burkinabe experts to share techniques. Senegalese universities launched competitions for organic amendments. The concept, however fragile, was gaining traction. And with every new experiment, the question grew sharper. Could buried waste become the seed of regional sovereignty? At home, the project ignited a cultural transformation. Markets once clogged with unsold fruit found new purpose. Traders collaborated with cooperatives to divert spoiled stock into soil. Women organized melon days to turn waste into microeconomies, selling compost to nearby villages and funding schools with the proceeds. Children buried melons in class experiments, learning that even decay could nourish life. Farmers who had once relied on aid shipments saw with their own eyes seedlings emerging from dust. A shift was underway not just in soil, but in spirit. Yet the international backlash never relented. Aid dispersals slowed, citing policy concerns. Editorials abroad cautioned against false hope. But inside Burkina Faso, faith in Project Oasis deepened. Success, locals argued, was not about hectares transformed, but about dignity restored. Graffiti in Ouagadougou depicted green fists breaking chains. Folk songs praised water beneath the dust. The imagery of melons buried in sand had become a metaphor for sovereignty. Traoré's government seized the symbolism, presenting the initiative as proof that Africa could innovate on its own terms. Abroad, reactions reflected geopolitical divides. European voices warned of destabilized markets. American analysts described the initiative as a risk to the architecture of aid. Russian and Chinese outlets, by contrast, celebrated the experiment as ingenuity born of necessity. Turkish and African media highlighted the marriage of science with ancestral wisdom. What Burkina Faso had buried in its desert was no longer just fruit, it was a challenge to the global order. Today, Project Oasis stands at a crossroads. In the fields, early signs of soil revival give farmers hope. In towns, communities are reclaiming waste as wealth. Across borders, neighbors are asking whether the model can travel, but in boardrooms and diplomatic halls, unease grows. For if a watermelon can disrupt billion-dollar markets, challenge entrenched aid systems, and stir a narrative of dignity, then perhaps sovereignty itself can germinate from decay. The story now unfolding in Burkina Faso is not only about melons, nor even about farming. It is about the possibility that resilience need not be imported. It is about a people daring to compost their dependency and plant their future in the dust. The world may laugh, resist, or conspire, but beneath the Sahel sands lies a quiet revolution. And revolutions, once seeded, are not easily contained.